It was a typical afternoon when Jessica, a black mother in her mid-30s, decided to take her adopted daughter, Emily, to the park. The weather was perfect for a stroll, a gentle breeze swaying the trees and the sun shining brightly, casting a warm glow over everything. Emily, a bright, curious 7-year-old with soft blonde hair and wide blue eyes, had been asking for days to visit the park near their home, a peaceful, community-oriented space in a predominantly white neighborhood. Jessica had her usual mix of emotions when it came to taking Emily out in public. There was always that underlying tension, a quiet awareness of the judgment they might face as a black mother with a white child. But it was a normal day, and Jessica had decided that today, they would enjoy it as mother and daughter, without any worry. They had packed a small picnic basket with sandwiches, and Emily carried her favorite storybook, excited for the outing. When they arrived at the park, it was as lively as usual. Kids were playing on the swings, people were walking their dogs, and others were sitting on benches reading or chatting. Jessica felt a wave of calm wash over her. She'd lived in the area for a few years now, and while there were always subtle reminders that she was different, most people seemed to mind their own business. That's what she liked about this park, the anonymity it provided. It felt like a safe space for a mother and her child to simply be. Emily, as always, ran toward the play area, eager to join the other kids on the swings. Jessica followed her, keeping an eye out but trying not to hover too much. It was one of those moments when she could almost forget about the weight of the world and just enjoy being a mom. Emily's laughter echoed as she kicked her legs higher and higher, and Jessica smiled, her heart swelling with pride. They were just a mother and daughter on a simple trip to the park, enjoying the day together. But in the background, a woman named Karen was watching them. Karen had been sitting on a nearby bench with her husband, eyes scanning the park, and when she noticed Jessica and Emily, something in her shifted. There was a noticeable look of confusion, followed by discomfort. She stared for a moment too long, almost as if she were trying to figure out what was going on. Karen was in her early 50s, blonde with a perfectly manicured appearance, the kind of woman who seemed to pride herself on being in control of everything around her. She had grown up in this neighborhood, and to her, it was a place where things should be orderly. People should fit in, look like everyone else, and certainly not cause any disturbances. Jessica's presence in the park with a young white child didn't fit into that mold. Karen shifted uncomfortably on the bench, then nudged her husband, a slight frown on her face. "Do you see that?" she asked him, her voice low but unmistakably suspicious. Her husband glanced over, briefly observing the scene. "What?" "The mom with the little girl?" he asked, clearly uninterested. Karen's expression darkened. "There's something off about it," she muttered, more to herself than to him. Her husband, a man in his late 50s with a gruff demeanor, shrugged and went back to scrolling through his phone. But Karen couldn't look away. There was something about Jessica's calm demeanor that struck her as too good to be true. She didn't fit the type of people she was used to seeing in the park, and in that moment, Karen's mind began to race. Why was a black woman with a white child? The suspicion began to gnaw at her, a small but persistent whisper in her head telling her that something wasn't right. The longer she watched, the more convinced she became that she needed to act. Jessica, oblivious to the gaze of the woman sitting across the park, continued enjoying her day with Emily. She helped her daughter off the swing and guided her toward the nearby picnic area, where they sat down to enjoy their sandwiches. Emily was animated, telling her mother about the story she had been reading and the characters she loved. Jessica listened attentively, her mind still relaxed, as if nothing could disturb this perfect moment. They were just two people, a mother and a daughter, sharing time in a beautiful place. But Karen's discomfort only grew. The longer she watched them, the more certain she became that something was wrong. She couldn't put her finger on it, but there was something about Jessica's presence in the park that felt off. She wasn't part of the established group. There was no reason for a black woman to be in such a predominantly white area with a white child unless something was wrong. Karen's thoughts twisted in unhealthy directions. What if she's not really the girl's mother? What if this is some sort of kidnapping? Karen muttered to herself, her stomach turning with paranoia. The idea seemed to grow inside her, becoming an undeniable certainty in her mind. She couldn't leave it alone, she had to do something about it. As the minutes passed, Karen's anxiety reached its peak. The confusion and suspicion clouded her judgment. Without thinking any further, she stood up from the bench, leaving her husband behind, and began walking toward the area where Jessica and Emily were sitting. Her steps were purposeful, though her heart was pounding in her chest. She was going to confront them, she thought. She wasn't sure exactly what she was going to say, but she knew she had to make sure everything was okay. In her mind, her actions were justified. She was doing the right thing. Jessica didn't notice Karen approaching until she was right beside them, standing awkwardly a few feet away. "Excuse me?" Jessica said, trying to keep her voice steady, though her heart was racing now. "She's my daughter. I adopted her. What's the issue?" Her voice shook just slightly, but she was trying to maintain composure. The last thing she wanted was to make a scene, especially in front of Emily, who was now looking up at the woman with wide eyes, sensing the change in the air. Karen didn't back down. "I don't believe you. This doesn't seem right. I'm calling the police." Her words were sharp, final. Jessica's eyes widened in disbelief. This was happening again. Another encounter with someone who couldn't accept their family dynamic, who was willing to escalate things based on assumptions and stereotypes. Before Jessica could respond, Karen had already turned around, pulling out her phone with trembling hands. Jessica stood frozen, her mind racing. She couldn't believe what was happening. Why was Karen doing this? She hadn't done anything wrong. There was no need to call the police. But Karen was determined, convinced that her suspicions were valid. The phone was already at her ear, and Jessica could hear her muffled words to the 911 operator. The air around them felt thick with tension, and Jessica's mind was filled with a mix of disbelief and growing fear. What was going to happen next? The hum of the phone's dial tone echoed in Karen's ear, a strange comfort in the midst of the storm she was stirring. She wasn't sure what she expected, but the certainty in her chest was undeniable. The longer she stared at Jessica, the more her imagination ran wild, weaving a narrative that justified her decision. "I'm doing the right thing," she muttered under her breath as she listened to the operator pick up. "I'm just protecting my community." The 911 operator's voice came through, crisp and professional, but Karen could barely hear it over the pounding in her own head. 911, what's your emergency? The operator asked, trying to sound calm and neutral. "There's a woman in the park with a child who doesn't belong to her." Karen's voice was trembling but firm. "I'm not sure what's going on, but the child is white, and the woman is black. I don't know if she's her mother or if something's wrong. I think she's kidnapping her." The operator paused, perhaps processing the oddness of the call or maybe just trying to make sense of it. After a brief silence, the operator responded. "Ma'am, I need you to stay calm. Can you describe what's happening right now?" Karen's voice became more frantic. "She's sitting with the child at the playground. They look so out of place. I think she might be lying about being the mother. I'm really concerned. Can you send someone over here? The park is usually safe, but now I feel uncomfortable." "Ma'am," the operator said, keeping her tone professional, "please stay at a safe distance and do not confront the individual. Help is on the way, and an officer will arrive shortly." Karen's grip on the phone tightened as she nodded, even though she knew the operator couldn't see her. She watched as Jessica, unaware of the impending storm, continued to help Emily with her sandwich. The calmness of their actions only seemed to intensify the heat rising within Karen. She had made the call now, and there was no turning back. The police would arrive soon, and she could finally have her suspicions validated. Jessica, on the other hand, stood in a fog of confusion and frustration. She had been through moments like this before, but never had it felt so surreal. The accusatory tone of the woman's words hung in the air, still ringing in her ears. Her mind raced as she processed the situation. How could this be happening? In a world that already made her feel like an outsider at times, she had to endure this public humiliation. She glanced at Emily, who was clutching her book tightly in her small hands, her face furrowed with concern as she realized something was wrong. Jessica could feel her daughter's eyes on her, and that was the last thing she needed right now. She had to protect Emily. Turning her gaze back to Karen, Jessica felt her heart rate accelerate. She wanted to walk away, to pick up her daughter and go home, to escape this moment. But the reality was, Karen had already crossed a line. She had called the police. The sirens would be coming soon. And despite all her calm efforts, Jessica knew she had to stand her ground, if only to show Emily that this kind of ignorance would never overpower them. "Please just go away," Jessica muttered under her breath, more to herself than Karen. But the woman seemed resolute, eyes narrowed in judgment, still clutching the phone to her ear. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Jessica tried to stay calm, her mind still racing as she looked for any sign of help or ally in the park. She noticed a few people glancing over, but no one intervened. The silence of the bystanders was deafening. Karen's face twisted with the satisfaction of knowing she had done something. She was in control now. No one would question her anymore. No one would question what was happening in this safe park. Then, in the distance, Jessica heard the wail of sirens. It started as a low hum in the background, growing louder as it neared the park. It was a sound she had heard many times before, but this time, it filled her with dread. The police were on their way. Karen's call was no longer a whisper in the air, it was a reality, and Jessica was at the center of it. She could already feel the eyes of the few remaining park-goers on her, some filled with curiosity, some with judgment. They were witnesses now, not to an event, but to an accusation that weighed heavily on her. The first police car rolled into the park, the flashing lights cutting through the calm afternoon. It seemed surreal to Jessica that the serene day, which had started with her enjoying a peaceful afternoon with her daughter, was now about to unravel in front of her eyes. Emily, sensing the change, reached for her hand, her small fingers curling around Jessica's. "Mommy, what's happening?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Jessica squeezed her daughter's hand, trying to mask her own anxiety. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said, her voice more composed than she felt. "We'll be fine." A second car arrived shortly after, followed by two officers, one a tall man in his 40s, his face set in a serious expression, and the other a young woman, barely out of her 20s, looking around as if unsure of what to make of the situation. Karen's eyes locked onto the officers, and she immediately straightened up, her stance filled with a false sense of authority. She rushed toward them, eager to explain her side of the story. "Officers," she began, her voice clipped, "I'm so glad you're here. There's something wrong with that woman and her child. I think she's kidnapping her. It just doesn't seem right." The officers looked at Karen with a mix of concern and confusion but did not respond immediately. They turned their gaze toward Jessica and Emily, who were still sitting on the bench. The tall officer, after a long pause, made his way toward them with deliberate steps. "Ma'am, can you tell us what's going on here?" he asked, his tone neutral but firm. Jessica stood, her hand still holding Emily's, her mind whirling with disbelief. How had things escalated this far? "We're just here to have a quiet afternoon," Jessica said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I'm her mother. She's my daughter. There's nothing wrong." But the officer didn't seem convinced. Instead, he looked over at Karen, who was now explaining her side of the story in a voice that carried with it an air of certainty, almost as if she were the one in charge of the situation. "I told them, officer. This woman doesn't belong here. She's with a white child, and it just doesn't add up. You need to do something." The young officer shifted uncomfortably but stepped forward. "Ma'am, I need to ask you a few questions," she said to Jessica. The air around them felt thick with tension. "Can you provide any identification to confirm your relationship to the child?" Jessica's heart sank. It was happening. She was being asked to prove herself, to justify her very existence as a mother to her own child. She reached into her bag and pulled out her ID and Emily's adoption papers, her hands trembling slightly. The officer took the papers without a word, flipping through them quickly. Jessica watched as the officer's face softened, just slightly. For a moment, Jessica dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, this would be over soon. But then, just as quickly as that hope appeared, it vanished when Karen stepped forward, her expression still tight with suspicion. "That doesn't prove anything," she said, her voice laced with doubt. "Anyone could have those papers." Her words hung in the air, more damaging than any accusation. The young officer glanced between Jessica and Karen, sensing the emotional weight of the situation. The older officer, however, stayed quiet, his eyes narrowed. He was evaluating the situation, but there was something in his posture that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by Karen's words. For the next few minutes, Jessica tried to hold her ground, staying calm even though every fiber of her being screamed for her to lash out. Emily's small hand in hers was the only thing keeping her grounded. The minutes dragged on, each second an eternity. It wasn't just the tension of the situation that unnerved Jessica, it was the sudden, overwhelming realization that her presence was being questioned, her identity scrutinized. She was being seen as a threat, not a mother, simply because of the color of her skin. The younger officer, still holding the adoption papers, walked over to her partner, and they began to whisper between themselves, their words lost in the swirl of emotions and noise around them. Jessica's eyes never left Emily, who was now sitting quietly by her side, clearly anxious but still trying to understand why the adults were acting this way. Every instinct in Jessica's body screamed at her to protect her child, to make sure Emily understood that this moment wasn't normal, wasn't right. But she also knew that she couldn't let the hate of others break their bond. Then, the officer returned to Jessica with the papers still in his hand, his expression unreadable. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The storm had only just begun. The young officer approached with a calm yet stern expression, holding the adoption papers in one hand. Jessica could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. The silence that hung between them felt suffocating, as though time had frozen, allowing every word and action to be magnified. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but her nerves were raw. Emily, sitting beside her, looked up with wide eyes, her innocence only deepening the gravity of the situation. Jessica couldn't help but feel her daughter's anxiety in the air, a silent plea for reassurance. She squeezed Emily's hand tighter, feeling the familiar warmth of her child, but it wasn't enough to ease the tension that had now enveloped them. The officer studied the adoption papers, flipping through them carefully. Jessica watched, her heart racing as she anxiously waited for the moment when she could explain that this had all been a mistake. But instead of relief, all she felt was the growing sense that this moment, this horrible moment, was far from over. The officer's face was unreadable, and when he finally looked up, his gaze shifted from the papers to Jessica's eyes. His voice was steady, but his words felt heavy. "We'll need to confirm these documents with social services," he said. "It's standard procedure when there's a situation like this." Jessica's stomach dropped. Confirm these documents? She had already presented the papers, but now they wanted to call social services to verify that her daughter truly belonged to her? It was as though her very identity was under suspicion, as if the simple act of being a black woman with a white child was an anomaly that had to be proven, questioned, and justified. Jessica felt her face flush with anger and frustration, but she held her composure, not wanting to escalate things further. "I've already given you the papers," she said, her voice firm but calm. "There's no need to confirm anything. This is my daughter. We've been through this process for years. We're just here to enjoy the park. Why are you treating us like this?" The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced over at Karen, who stood at the edge of the scene, watching with a smug expression. Jessica could see the satisfaction in Karen's eyes, the twisted sense of power she felt from having made the call. She had done what she thought was right, and now she had the full attention of the police. She had succeeded in casting doubt on their family. Karen, emboldened by the officer's presence, took a step forward. "I'm just trying to keep the children in this park safe," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "I don't know if this is really her daughter. I don't know if she should be here." Her words were designed to stir the pot, to reinforce her own prejudices and fears. Jessica felt the heat rise in her chest as Karen's accusation echoed in the air. There was no reason for this. No reason at all. The rage started to bubble within her, but she forced herself to stay composed, to avoid falling into the trap of anger that Karen was clearly hoping for. The older officer, who had been silently observing, finally spoke. His voice was low, but it carried a sense of authority. "Ma'am, it's clear that you're upset," he said, addressing Jessica. "But I need to remind you that we're here to ensure the safety of everyone involved. If you'd like to file a complaint later, you can do so. But for now, I need you to cooperate." The words were like a slap across the face. Cooperate? Jessica had already done everything she could. She had shown the papers, she had explained her situation, and yet she was still being treated like an outsider. Still being forced to prove herself. The system was supposed to work for people like her, to protect them from these kinds of assumptions, but it wasn't. Not now. Not today. As the officers continued to confer quietly, Jessica couldn't help but wonder how many other families, how many other mothers, had been forced into this kind of situation. How many had been falsely accused, scrutinized, and made to feel small, simply because of the way they looked or the children they were raising. She thought of the countless black families who had been subjected to this kind of judgment, often with disastrous consequences. The stories of black men and women, unjustly accused and mistreated, flooded her mind. She could feel the sting of history pressing down on her, the weight of all those past wrongs suddenly crashing into her present. "Mom," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Jessica's heart broke as she looked down at her daughter, who was trying to make sense of the scene unfolding before her. She wanted to protect her, to shield her from the reality of what was happening, but the truth was unavoidable. Emily's gaze was filled with confusion and fear, and Jessica felt her own tears rising, but she swallowed them back. She couldn't let her daughter see her break. She couldn't let her daughter see how deep the wound went, how deeply this unjust situation was cutting into her soul. The officers continued to deliberate, exchanging quiet words that Jessica couldn't make out. She knew they were just following procedure, that this was routine for them, but for her, for Emily, this was far from routine. This was a moment of reckoning, a moment that would alter the way she saw the world, a moment that would change her and Emily forever. The police presence wasn't just a nuisance, it was a reminder that, in the eyes of some, they were always going to be questioned, always going to be treated as less than, always going to be seen as a threat. As Jessica stood there, her mind racing, the air between her and the officers thick with uncertainty, a sudden thought struck her. This wasn't just happening to her. This was happening to everyone who had ever been labeled as other. As they left the park, Jessica looked down at Emily, who had been unusually quiet throughout the ordeal. "Are you okay, baby?" Jessica asked gently. Emily nodded, her small face still filled with confusion. "I don't understand, Mommy," she said quietly, her voice full of innocence. "Why did they think you weren't my mom?" Jessica's heart ached as she held her daughter close. "I don't know, sweetie," she whispered. "But no matter what anyone says, I'm always going to be your mom." And as they walked away, hand in hand, Jessica knew that, despite the darkness of the world around them, she would always fight to protect their bond, their love, and their right to simply exist in peace. Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally shifted. As she and Emily walked home, the familiar streets of their neighborhood seemed less welcoming, as if the event at the park had left an indelible mark on the world around her. The simple routine of their day, heading home after a trip to the park, felt like an act of defiance now. The weight of what had happened lingered heavily, and she couldn't help but replay every moment over and over in her head. She tried to focus on the present, on the familiar rhythm of her footsteps and the sound of Emily's laughter, but it was hard. The world she had known, the one where she could trust that her family would be accepted for who they were, had just been cracked open. That crack, that unsettling feeling, wasn't something that could be fixed or ignored. It was real, and it was there, lurking beneath the surface of everyday life. As they reached their apartment building, Jessica couldn't ignore the pressure building in her chest. She let Emily run ahead, pushing open the door and dashing up the stairs to their apartment, but Jessica lingered behind. Her mind was still spinning, and her body felt heavy with exhaustion. She leaned against the railing, staring out into the street below, her thoughts lost in the haze of what had just transpired. How could one person, one stranger, cause so much damage, create so much doubt, simply because they didn't understand? And what did it say about the world that this kind of thing could happen, not just to her, but to countless others, every single day? After a few moments, Jessica pushed herself off the railing and followed Emily up to their apartment. The moment she stepped inside, the noise of the outside world seemed to disappear. The apartment was a sanctuary, a safe space where she and Emily could be themselves without fear. Still, the events of the day had cast a shadow over the peaceful familiarity of their home. Jessica closed the door behind her and sank into the couch, staring at nothing in particular. She could feel the tears welling up in her eyes again, but she fought them back. Crying wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't fix what had happened. Emily, sensing the change in the atmosphere, walked over and climbed into Jessica's lap, her small arms wrapping around her tightly. Jessica held her, feeling the comfort of her daughter's embrace, but also the heartbreak. Emily was too young to fully understand what had happened, but she could sense her mother's distress. "Mommy, are you okay?" she asked softly, her voice full of concern. Jessica kissed her daughter's forehead, her heart swelling with love and protectiveness. "I'm okay, sweetie," she said, her voice thick. "Just a little tired. We'll be all right." But even as she said the words, she knew that they weren't entirely true. They would be all right, but not because of some magical fix. They would be all right because they would have to be. Because, as a black woman in a world that often didn't understand or accept her, Jessica had no choice but to keep moving forward, to keep protecting her daughter from the ugliness that existed in the world. She didn't want to pass on her pain to Emily, but she also knew that Emily was going to have to face it, sooner or later. The question was, how would she? And how could Jessica prepare her for something so insidious, so ingrained in society, that it could sneak up on them in the most ordinary of moments? Over the next few days, Jessica tried to return to some semblance of normalcy. She went to work, took Emily to school, and spent time with her neighbors, most of whom were kind and understanding. But the encounter at the park lingered in the back of her mind, a constant reminder that this world wasn't as safe or welcoming as she had once hoped. She couldn't shake the feeling that things would never be the same. That what had happened wasn't just an isolated incident, but part of a larger, more systemic issue that affected every aspect of their lives. One afternoon, while Jessica was running errands, she ran into an old friend from the community, Monica. Monica had been one of the first people to welcome Jessica when she moved to the neighborhood years ago, and over the years, they had become close. Monica was white, and their friendship had always been a testament to the fact that people of different races could connect, share their experiences, and support each other. But now, as Monica looked at Jessica with an expression of concern, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that things had changed, that the innocence they once shared had been tainted by the harsh reality of the world they lived in. "I heard about what happened at the park," Monica said, her voice soft and empathetic. "I just wanted to check in on you. Are you okay?" Jessica forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah, I'm okay," she replied, her tone flat. "Just one of those things, you know." Monica nodded, her brow furrowed in sympathy. "It shouldn't be one of those things," she said quietly. "You shouldn't have to go through that. No one should." Jessica sighed deeply, feeling the weight of the conversation settle over her. "I know," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But it happens. It happens more than people realize." Monica's face softened with understanding, and for a moment, the two of them simply stood there in silence. The moment felt like an unspoken acknowledgement of the injustice, an understanding of the pain that Jessica was carrying. But despite the comfort of having someone who understood, it also highlighted the harsh truth that, for people like Jessica, these encounters were a part of daily life. They were woven into the fabric of their existence, an ugly reminder that no matter how much progress had been made, there was still so much work to do. Later that evening, Jessica sat down with Emily to talk about what had happened. She wanted to explain, to make sure that Emily understood what had taken place, but she didn't want to burden her daughter with too much information. Emily was still so young, and Jessica didn't want to crush her spirit with the harsh realities of the world just yet. But the questions lingered. "Mom, why did they think you weren't my mom?" Emily had asked again and again, her confusion so pure and innocent that it broke Jessica's heart every time. Taking a deep breath, Jessica began, carefully choosing her words. "Well, sweetie, sometimes people can be confused. They don't always understand our family, and they might make mistakes because of that." "But I don't understand," Emily said, her eyes wide. "We're a family, right? You're my mommy." Jessica smiled gently, brushing a strand of hair from Emily's face. "Yes, sweetie. We are a family. And nothing can change that. No matter what anyone says, you and I are always going to be together." She hugged her daughter tightly, trying to convey all the love and strength she felt. But even as she did, she couldn't ignore the sting of reality. Emily might not fully understand now, but one day, she would. And Jessica hoped, with all her heart, that the world would be kinder to her daughter than it had been to her. As Jessica lay in bed that night, she thought about the future, about the difficult conversations, the moments of misunderstanding, the challenges that awaited Emily as she grew up. It would be a long road, and there would be more difficult days ahead. But Jessica was determined. She was determined to be strong, to protect Emily, and to continue fighting for the world she knew they both deserved. She couldn't change the past, but she could shape the future, one small step at a time. In the days and weeks that followed, Jessica kept her head high. She didn't let the incident define her. Instead, she used it as fuel, a reminder that the fight for equality, for justice, for understanding, was far from over. But it was a fight she was willing to face, alongside her daughter, every step of the way. And no matter what the world threw at them, they would face it together, as a family. Weeks had passed since the incident at the park, but the weight of it still lingered. Jessica had hoped that time would heal the wounds, but they didn't feel any less fresh. Every time she saw a mother and child together, a knot formed in her stomach. Every glance, every quiet murmur, reminded her of the way they had been treated, how they had been questioned, judged, and humiliated. She had tried to carry on, to push through the anger and frustration that had settled deep in her chest, but it wasn't easy. The moment had shaken her to her core, and the more she thought about it, the more she realized that it wasn't just about her, it was about something much bigger. It was about the way society still viewed people like her and Emily, the way they were seen as outsiders in a world that often didn't understand them. It had taken time, but Jessica was beginning to recognize something important. The events of that day weren't just a random, unfortunate encounter, they were part of a larger pattern, one that countless people of color experienced every day. She had thought, at first, that it was just an isolated incident, but now she could see that it was merely a reflection of the systemic issues that had been in place for generations. It was the prejudice that permeated the streets, the way people looked at her and her daughter and saw something wrong, something that didn't fit the mold of their expectations. She began to talk about it more openly with friends and family, sharing her experience and the feelings that came with it. At first, people had been sympathetic, but there was a distance, a sense of discomfort that always seemed to hover just beneath the surface. Jessica knew why. People didn't want to believe that the world they lived in could be so harsh, so unkind. But she couldn't ignore the reality any longer. She had been treated like a threat, like a problem to be solved. And in that moment, she had become acutely aware of how little power she had in a society that too often placed her in the role of the other. Still, it wasn't all doom and gloom. Through the anger and frustration, Jessica began to channel her pain into something positive. She started volunteering with local advocacy groups, working alongside other mothers who had faced similar challenges. They shared stories, experiences, and resources, helping one another navigate the complicated and often painful realities of raising children in a world that wasn't always kind to them. It was a small but powerful form of resistance, finding solidarity in each other, building a community of people who understood the struggles they faced and were determined to make a change. At home, Jessica noticed small shifts in Emily's demeanor. The questions, the confusion, had gradually started to fade, replaced with an understanding that was both naive and hopeful. Emily had never fully grasped the depth of what had happened at the park, but as the days went by, Jessica could see the quiet reflection in her daughter's eyes. There were moments when Emily would ask questions, more in curiosity than in confusion, as if trying to make sense of the world around her. "Why do people say you're not my mom, Mommy?" she would ask. "What's wrong with us?" Jessica always answered as best as she could, not wanting to burden Emily with the full weight of it all but still offering her a glimpse of the truth. "There's nothing wrong with us," she would say softly, holding Emily close. "Some people just don't understand, but that's okay. We know who we are, and that's all that matters." Over time, Jessica became more vocal about her experiences, sharing them on social media and participating in conversations that were happening across the country. The story of that day at the park, her experience as a mother, as a black woman, had struck a nerve with so many people. The outpouring of support was overwhelming, but it also came with a sense of responsibility. Jessica had become a voice for others who had been through similar situations, for those who had silently endured the same prejudice and discrimination. Her story wasn't just hers anymore, it belonged to the countless other mothers, fathers, and families who had been made to feel less than, simply because of the color of their skin or the way their families looked. Through the power of social media, Jessica found herself connecting with people she had never met before, all of them sharing their own stories, their own pain. There were messages of support from strangers, from people who had been moved by her courage and vulnerability. But there were also messages of anger, from those who couldn't understand why she was so upset, from those who dismissed her experience as an overreaction. But even in the face of these voices, Jessica felt empowered. She knew that sharing her story was a form of resistance, a way of shedding light on the darkness that so many people tried to ignore. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, Jessica sat down with Emily at the kitchen table to do their homework together. The noise of the world outside felt distant, and for a brief moment, it was just the two of them, mother and daughter, in the sanctuary of their home. Emily had a question that was as innocent as it was profound. "Mom, when we're older, will people still look at us like that?" Jessica paused for a moment, the question hanging in the air like a weight. She thought about it, about how much she wanted to give her daughter a world where she wouldn't have to face prejudice, a world where their family would be seen as normal, as valuable. But the truth was, she didn't know. She didn't know if things would get better. She didn't know if the world would ever change enough for Emily to feel safe and accepted without question. But what she did know was that she would fight for it, with everything she had. She would fight for Emily's future, for their future, and for the future of all families who had been marginalized, overlooked, and silenced. "I don't know, sweetie," Jessica said softly, looking her daughter in the eyes. "But I'll always be here to protect you, to teach you, and to help you understand the world as best as I can. And I'll never stop fighting for a better world for you." Emily smiled up at her, the simple, pure smile of a child who had faith in her mother's strength. "I'm glad you're my mom," she said, her voice filled with love. Jessica's heart swelled with emotion as she pulled her daughter into a tight embrace. For a moment, everything felt right. For a moment, the world outside didn't matter. What mattered was the bond between them, the love they shared, and the strength they drew from each other. The events of the past weeks had been painful, yes, but they had also brought Jessica closer to her daughter, to herself. She realized that the love she had for Emily, the love that they shared, was a powerful force that no one could ever take away. It was something no one could question, no matter how many times they tried to tear them down. The world wasn't perfect. It wasn't fair. But as long as she had Emily by her side, as long as they had each other, Jessica knew they could face anything. Together, they would navigate the challenges, the prejudices, and the injustices that lay ahead. They would find strength in their love, and they would continue to fight for a world where everyone, no matter who they were or where they came from, could be seen for who they truly were, worthy of love, respect, and belonging. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Jessica carried that hope with her. It wasn't a naive hope. It was a hope built on the belief that, no matter how difficult the fight, change was possible. And with every step she took, with every conversation she had, she was one step closer to creating the kind of world she wanted for Emily, a world where they could walk freely, without fear, without judgment, and with the knowledge that they were enough, just as they were. Months passed, but Jessica's resolve only grew stronger. The initial shock and pain of that fateful encounter at the park had faded, replaced by an ever-deepening sense of purpose. She had long since realized that the journey ahead would not be a quick one, nor would it be easy. But that didn't matter to her. Each day presented a new challenge, a new opportunity to educate, to raise awareness, and to stand firm in the truth of her experience. It wasn't just her fight anymore, it was a fight for her daughter, for all the children who would one day face the same ugly truths, and for every black person who had ever been made to feel less than. In the months that followed, Jessica found herself navigating the complexities of her identity with renewed clarity. It was no longer just about protecting Emily from the painful realities of the world, it was about preparing her to face those realities with strength and resilience. Jessica wanted Emily to grow up knowing that her blackness was not something to be ashamed of, but something to be proud of. She wanted her to understand the importance of community, of standing up for what was right, and of knowing her worth, even when the world tried to tell her otherwise. But the more Jessica immersed herself in conversations around race and identity, the more she realized how pervasive the issues were, how deeply ingrained prejudice was in every aspect of society. The systems of power that shaped their world were not going to change overnight, and the pain she had experienced, while undeniable, was not unique. It was a shared experience, a collective struggle that spanned generations. One evening, as Jessica sat in the quiet of her apartment, reflecting on everything that had happened, she received a phone call from her friend Monica. Monica had been a steady source of support through it all, always ready to lend an ear or a helping hand. But this call felt different. There was an urgency in Monica's voice, something that caught Jessica off guard. "Jessica, I've been thinking about what you said, about what happened at the park. And I think we need to do something more. I don't know what yet, but we need to make sure that what happened to you doesn't just fade away. We can't let it be forgotten." Jessica was quiet for a moment, absorbing Monica's words. She had heard many people express sympathy, but something about Monica's tone made her feel like they were on the cusp of something bigger. For so long, Jessica had felt like an individual in a sea of voices, each person struggling to be heard, to make a difference. But now, Monica's words made her realize that maybe, just maybe, there was a way for their voices to come together, for their pain and their hope to manifest into something tangible. "I agree," Jessica said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "But what can we do? What can we actually change?" Monica's answer was simple, yet powerful. "We can start by talking. By making sure people know this isn't just one isolated incident. It's a symptom of something much bigger. We can use our voices, our experiences, to shed light on the issue. We can speak out." Over the next few weeks, Jessica and Monica began to organize. They called on others who had been affected by racial prejudice, reaching out to individuals who had faced similar challenges and encouraging them to share their stories. Slowly, but surely, a network of people began to form: mothers, fathers, children, teachers, community leaders, all coming together to speak out against the injustices they had faced. They began hosting meetings, small at first, but growing steadily as more people came forward to join the cause. Jessica became a central figure in the movement. She wasn't a politician or a public figure, but she quickly realized that the power of her voice was just as potent. She began writing articles, sharing her experiences online, and giving interviews to local news outlets. Each time she spoke, she felt a sense of liberation, as though shedding the weight of the silence she had carried for so long. But more importantly, she felt a sense of connection to the larger community, a reminder that she wasn't alone. There were others out there who understood, who had lived through the same pain, and who were willing to take a stand. As the movement grew, so did the visibility of the issue. What started as a small group of concerned individuals soon turned into a larger collective that began to garner attention from the media, from local politicians, and even from businesses who had previously stayed silent. At first, the responses were mixed. Some people rallied behind them, offering support and resources. Others dismissed the movement as overblown or unnecessary, insisting that the issue wasn't as big as it seemed. But Jessica knew better. She knew that the issue wasn't just about one incident, it was about a much deeper, more entrenched system of inequality. One evening, Jessica attended a community meeting where a local journalist spoke about the importance of amplifying the voices of those who had been marginalized. The journalist shared statistics, stories, and examples of how racism had affected countless communities, and how it continued to shape the world around them. As she listened, Jessica felt a surge of pride and determination. She wasn't alone in her fight. And she wasn't fighting just for herself, she was fighting for everyone who had been made to feel less than, everyone who had been made to feel invisible. The following week, Jessica was invited to speak at a rally in the city. It was a large event, one that had been organized to raise awareness about racial injustice and to demand accountability from local authorities. Jessica felt a mix of nerves and excitement as she stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd of people who had come to hear her speak. She knew that her words mattered, that her experience had the power to touch hearts and open minds. But she also knew that her story was only one of many, that the fight for justice was far from over. When it was her turn to speak, Jessica took a deep breath and began. She shared the story of that fateful day at the park, the pain and confusion she had felt when she was questioned, when she was treated as if she didn't belong. She spoke of the hurt, the anger, and the fear that had followed her, but also of the strength and resilience that had emerged from it. She spoke about her daughter, Emily, and how important it was for her to grow up in a world where she was seen and accepted for who she was. The crowd was silent as Jessica spoke, and when she finished, there was a moment of stillness before the applause began. It wasn't loud or boisterous, but it was heartfelt. People were listening. They were hearing her. And in that moment, Jessica felt a deep sense of pride. She wasn't just telling her story, she was part of a movement, a collective force that was slowly but surely pushing for change. The rally marked a turning point. The movement continued to grow, gaining momentum with every story shared, with every voice raised. Jessica realized that the road ahead was long, that there would be setbacks and challenges, but she also knew that they had already accomplished something important. They had started a conversation. They had begun to shift the narrative. And for the first time in a long time, Jessica felt a glimmer of hope. In the weeks that followed, more changes began to take shape. Local officials started meeting with community leaders to discuss ways to address racial disparities in the area. The media began covering the movement more extensively, shedding light on the systemic issues that had been ignored for far too long. And slowly, people started to listen, not just to the voices of those who had been hurt, but to the voices of those who were working to create a better, more just world. Jessica didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if her efforts would lead to sweeping reforms, or if the road to equality would continue to be as difficult and frustrating as it had been. But she knew one thing for sure: she would keep fighting. She would keep speaking out. She would keep raising her voice for herself, for Emily, and for all those who had been silenced for far too long. Together, they were creating a future where they could walk through the world with their heads held high, where they could face each new day without fear, and where they could raise their children knowing that they were enough, just as they were.